Good afternoon. I'm going to call to order this meeting of the Public Health, Environment, Civil Rights, and Engagement Committee for Monday, February 12th, 2018. My name is Philippe Cunningham, and I am the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are council members Schrader, Gordon, Johnson, and Jenkins. Let the record reflect we have a quorum. We have 10 items on the agenda today, 8 consent items and 2 discussion items. The consent items are approving Number 1, Southside Green Zone Task Force appointment, approving the council appointment of Darius Gray, seat 9, Ward 9, to an unexpired 1-year term ending August 31st, 2018. Just wanted to share very briefly that Darius is a community member who worships, and plays within the Phillips and Cedar Riverside neighborhoods as a current UMN student and environmental justice advocate and professional. 2, contract amendment with Riverview Windows, Inc. for lead remediation work. This is authorizing an increase to contract number C39747 with Riverview Windows, Inc. in the amount of $200,000. This is connected to a December 2014 HUD grant for lead hazard reduction strategies, and the increase is going to be covered by grants and funds already allocated. Items number 3 and 4 are internship programs through school-based clinics. They're 1-year internships and their graduate level clinical hours. And then 5, 6, 7, and 8 are ordinances that are being referred to staff. Do committee members have any questions? Seeing no questions, I move the approval of the consent agenda. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and that item is approved. Today, again, we have 2 discussion items. Our first discussion item is receiving and filing a presentation on Black History Month with an overview of culture, community assets, and challenges. Anthony Taylor, African American Community Specialist with the NCR Department, will be giving us a short presentation. Mr. Taylor, if you will please come up to the mic.
Chair Cunningham, council members, good day. My name is Anthony Taylor. I am the African American Community Specialist for the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations. And today I stand before you to have a presentation in honor of Black History Month about the African American community. The agenda for today are talking a little bit about the goals and visions of our department and my work, the purpose of my work, a few numbers on the demographics about the city of Minneapolis, the leadership structure in our city, and also too to celebrate some of the positive things that are happening in our community. But with those positives, there are some issues and some feedback that I've received from my many meetings with different community members and organizations within the city. What's our vision? Our vision is for just and fair engagement that connects residents to achieve our one goal, Minneapolis, eliminate our disparities so residents can fully participate in government process. The African American community is a wonderful community. I'll just go back a little bit just to say I started in September working with NCR and through my travels and talking with many different people. Minneapolis is wonderful. I think what happens is that there's a narrative out there that there's a lot of negative things that are happening. But as you see in my PowerPoint, we'll be able to celebrate a lot of those because I think it's important that the word gets out. I'd like to tell different people when I'm speaking and talking to them about, I would love to have M.A. Roscoe come on West Broadway. a lot more than what she does, and some of the things that happens on Channel 9 to celebrate some of the things that happens in Minneapolis. Again, if we're talking about the cultural community, the African American community comprises of 18% of the Minneapolis population. It's a very rich history on both sides in North and South in Minneapolis. And some of the wonderful things that are happening are a lot of the growth development with small businesses that's happening in our community. But also there's some challenges, and really we're talking about systemic racism, economic growth, and also justice are some of the themes that I hear as I do my work in the community. As the African American community specialist, my job is to engage community to enhance city access. What has to happen, I think, in our community is that our community has to get more involved in the process, and also, too, how the city can help in the community as far as engagement activities. The purpose of my work is to provide those outreach strategies to city government as well as to merge the two. I think it's important that people are well represented of their community to be a part of that process. That's my job. Open up clear communication channels so we can work together to make our city as diverse as it is that we see when we walk around our community. So, and why do we need this? You know, it's all about building capacity to work within the city, ensure that it is an inclusive environment. Our results are really to be transparent and also to be accountable. And I think that's vitally important when we talk about issues in our community. There are some healing that needs to happen as well in our community too, and I think I'll talk about that as we go. And just a little bit of our demographics. Minneapolis, as you guys well know, total population is a little over 400,000, 60% white, 39% of color. And again, the breakdown within the community, 19% African American, 9.7 Hispanic, 5% Asian, 2 or more races, 3.7, as well as American Indian, about 1.2. That tells you a lot about our community as well. And as you look at the next slide, these are the breakdown of the demographics. The near north has the highest concentration of African American population at 89% compared to the total whole, which is 39.7 in Minneapolis. Near north, as you can see the numbers, Willard Hay and the Jordan area comprise most of our African American community. As we talk about Black History Month and I look upon a lot of the things that are happening in our community, there's different leadership structures in our community. There's the traditional leadership structure, and there's also the rising structures in our community. The youth-driven causes, I think, are important. When I talk to different people about the civil rights movement really started by the students, by the children. That's what happened in our civil rights at that time. Families could not really necessarily protest because they had to go to work the next day in fear of being arrested. So it was really the children who sparked the civil rights movement, kind of like our Black Lives Matter movement, our ongoing Me Too movement. I think we'll see some more action with that as far as our youth. But compared to also our traditional leadership structures, which are the faith-based organizations, the pillar organizations in our community, the Urban League, the NAACP, Mad Dads, I can go on and on, but our leadership structure in this city is strong. Our pillar community organizations are strong as well, and they also provide a solid, their reputation is solid. People go to places they're comfortable with. Again, if we're talking about Black History Month, we talk about the civil rights movement, the churches were sanctuaries as well. So when we talk about our faith-based leadership with Shiloh Temple, New Salem, and of course our elected officials. Anytime the community has needs, wants to communicate some things, those organizations are strong in our community, and they always will be. Also, we talk about the progress that's happening in Minneapolis. I listed a few things, but I could have 18 slides about the positive things that are happening in North Minneapolis. Specifically, if we're talking about that Penn and Plymouth corridor, Thor Construction, I think, is a blessing to our community. One of the largest African-American owned construction companies who are having their home base in North Minneapolis. The North Point expansion is a great thing for the community, as well as the Green Zone project for the Northern Metals Decree that's going to start happening in North Minneapolis. I think it's very, very special. And in our grocery stores, you talk about something that's been well documented about a need since Cub Food left, Target left, and then Cub Food came, but it's not necessarily represented the entire community. With the North Market and the Worth Cooperative Grocery Store are extreme positives, and we really need to celebrate those things tremendously. Some of the community interest that we talk about that I have mentioned before, I've talked to a lot of different people. I've talked to North nonprofit organizations. I've talked to a lot of different community members, neighborhood associations, just different people throughout my time in the city. There's three themes that come up when I talk to people. One is police and community relations. I hear a lot about the fact that I think that needs to happen more in our community. There is some open wounds that have not been closed as far as some of the issues in our community, and I think those are one of the biggest things. People talk about accountability, people talk about justice, people talk about transparency, are some of the themes that I hear in our community, as well as job growth and creation. Again, we do have a lot of organizations that are helping in that process. I talk about Northside Funders Group, Neon, as well as Emerge. Those are organizations that are still helping to be a part of that process, but at the end of the day, there's still more to be done. I hear these themes quite a bit. And also, and these are not even 1, 2, and 3, they're 1A, 1B, 1C. We talk about affordable housing as well. You know, I stand before you today almost preaching to the choir because you guys know the issues as well too. So, but again, these are things that I hear that people really, really are concerned about in their community. And like I said before, small business development as well. People are generally concerned and anxious to have things a lot better in their community because it's important to them. And again, that narrative sometimes is not really necessarily broadcast because the community doesn't really have an opportunity to speak on some of those things. And I think if you listen to radio and newspapers, you would feel that Minneapolis is not the great place that it is, but it's very true that it's a great place and a great community with some hardworking folks. My charge as I go in 2018 is to have initiatives in the community from what the people wanted, what they told me. They said, Anthony, you need to do this. Besides Juneteenth being back in the park was one of the other issues that I heard. I'll talk about a few things. February 27th, NCR and the Division for Race and Equity will have a Black History Month program on February 27th in the Rotunda. When we talk about Black History Month, the speaker will be Lisa McNair. She is a sister of Denise McNair, one of the 4 little girls who was killed in the 16th Street bombing in Birmingham. And she'll talk about hope, she'll talk about healing, and also about the political times, how they mirror back then and today. I think our department, this is our first Black History Month celebration, but she talks about hope, she talks about resiliency, and she talks about justice. CAP HC and our department will partner to have some community renters resource forums, rights and responsibilities on what it is to, what it means to be responsible, to advocate for justice in the housing market, credit repair, everything that the renters are facing now. The idea is to bring this to the table and hope to educate people. It's also well to bring landlords to the table who are more friendly to those citizens who need some affordable housing. We need to get the word out. We need to make sure that people understand that this is an important process for our community, as well as a police and community relations forum. I've had some conversations with Deputy Knight about bringing some forums to the community around implicit bias. Talked to Chair Cunningham about the possibility of expanding this whole series where we would be able to have Metro Transit police, park police, to have these forums, to have discussions. When I talked to Chair Cunningham, he really opened my eyes about the history of conversations in the community. So around the implicit bias training, also too bringing the different generations together to talk about some of the things that's happened. I know history says that at times it did not happen. I think well-meaning, authentic conversations around police and community relations are important. And I think generationally, each generation has issues, different issues. So we talk about the older folks, we talk about the so-called millennials. I don't like to use that word, but I think it describes the young people. I think they have different needs. Our initiative is to have those conversations and do it authentic and be able to progress in our relations with our community. And also a community resource fair. I think it's important. Access to information doesn't happen. There's so many wonderful things that happen in our community. There's so many different organizations. There's so many ways to help people. I don't think people really know how to access that information to be able to sit and be able to find out exactly what their needs are and how they can access that. So when we talk about the lot of nonprofits, the organizations, and the people that can help our community, I think being able to have a fair that brings everybody to the table is very important. Our community also has learning labs that we also do in the community, talk about African-American community and how to effectively engage the work in the community. So, and again, with that, I stand before you with any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Do any committee members have any questions for Mr. Taylor? Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Cunningham and Mr. Taylor. I'm curious. You highlighted a number of really positive things that are going on around African American community and African American life in Minneapolis. I'm wondering, how does the Urban Scholars Project fit into that? It is a program of the city, but does that sort of fit into the, I guess I would call it positive developments related to African Americans in the Twin Cities?
Chair Cunningham, Council Person Jenkins, everything is all related when it's positive. What I could not do is list everything that is positive in the community. But yes, the urban scholars are a part of the process when we talk about positive things in our community. So yes.
And then just as a little follow-up, sorry, the green zones, can you talk about, you identified that as one of the projects. Can you just expand on that project a little bit?
Sure. I happen to be a part of the proposal review for the Northern Meadows Decree Green Zone project that's happening in North Minneapolis, where we selected organizations to start with engagement on the green zone initiatives that are happening in North Minneapolis. With that, moving forward, this organization will start to have outreach opportunities in the community. They formulate the entire project. What our department will do will help and assist in those engagement initiatives for the green zone. We know South has a green zone project. Now this is North Minneapolis now. So, and it's really, really beneficial because I think this gives a community organization to do more outreach, to talk about a lot of different things as far as the environment and how we can move forward with helping our community. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Just wanted to add as well onto that, that Step Up and Urban Scholars are doing a really great job making sure that Black students and students from North Minneapolis are included. So just wanted to give that shout out. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. And I don't really have any questions, but I just had some comments. I appreciated you coming in here. And as you were speaking, it occurred to me that a lot of times with Black History Month, we talk about National Black History and talk about that a lot. And even when we get more local, it's usually Minnesota and what's happened here. But that Minneapolis has a very, I'm sure, like other locations, a very unique history when it comes to Black history. And we actually have some pretty terrible stories that some people are aware of and many others are not aware of. I remember we did the one read where we read about the grace of silence, and we heard about how horrible it was for some families who were trying to integrate certain neighborhoods. That was kind of an individual case. I remember when we had the occupation at the 3rd Precinct, and everybody was reminded, oh, that used to be a community center that was started by activists in the neighborhood, the way, and it was taken over by the city and became a police precinct. So, and then, and don't forget, we have the research that's going on about covenants, our housing covenants that basically institutionalized segregation and baked it into people's deeds when they bought a home, who they could sell to and who they couldn't sell to. And I think it really helps people understand why we have to focus some energy on disparities and on the problem and issues around race in our city if they understand the history a little bit better. And so I think it's great that we concentrate on it and think about it, especially in terms of Minneapolis. And I hope, I know we don't have a lot of planning, and I'm sure a lot of this is already going on, but I hope as we have our event later in the month and those things, we also help shed light on not just maybe our more shameful history, but also the champions who were there in the 60s in the civil rights movement in the city, and those people who were integrating neighborhoods, and maybe those allies who stood with them to help. So we have that story because I know that it can help as we're making policy for the future if we have more of a cultural or community understanding of where we are in this whole time frame and what we maybe need to do to help repair some of the damages done in the past and move forward. So appreciate that we had some time on the committee to talk about this and that I got to make my little pitch there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say before we wrap up, thank you so much for the presentation today, as well as the work that you have taken on. There is a lot of healing work and trust building that has to be done between the Black community and institutions like the city of Minneapolis. So you have a big charge. And so thank you very much for not only taking that on, but also coming here today to tell us a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And seeing no further questions, I move to receive and file this item. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and that item is received and filed. And our last discussion item for today is the 2017 Joint Study Report, Joint Disparity Study Report, receiving and filing the City of Minneapolis's 2017 Minnesota Joint Disparity Study Report. So we have Velma Corbel, Director of the Civil Rights Department, as well as representatives from Keene Independent Research, who will be giving us a presentation today. Ms. Corbel, and please come up to the mic, and if you'll say your name, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Cunningham. My name is Sean Skibby. I'll actually be introducing Keene Independent Research. Councilmember Cunningham, Chair Cunningham, members of the committee, my name is Sean Skibby. I'm the Contract Compliance Division Director here at the City of Minneapolis. The purpose of the request for council action today is to request the committee receive and file the 2017 Disparity Study and offer this committee an opportunity to review the study's findings with its author, Keene Independent Research. Keene will be presenting the study's findings here today momentarily and digging into the details, and will also be available to answer questions from the committee. We are also seeking to commence with opening the public comment period for this study to be open until 4 p.m. on Wednesday, February 28th, 2018. And then I want to note that both Keene and myself will be available for questions during the presentation today, as well as any questions or comments afterwards that the committee members may have. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Keene Independent to come up and present the study and talk more about it in detail.
Welcome, and could you please state your name for the record as well?
Hi, I'm David Keene. I'm a principal of Keene Independent Research. I would like to introduce Annette Keene, who is also principal of Keene Independent Research, and Blanca Monter. He's a senior consultant with Keene Independent Research. Annette and I are from Colorado and Arizona, and Blanca is from the Twin Cities area. Well, this dovetails nicely with our previous presentation because we have things to celebrate about the progress that the city has made in terms of reaching out to minority and women-owned businesses in the Twin Cities area, as well as some further challenges. So we'll dive into this. This is a very long study. We've been working on this for a year and a half. We involved a number of local team members as well that interviewed local businesses, trade associations, community members, as well as thousands of businesses throughout the state over the phone. We held a public meeting here in Minneapolis a year and a half ago, right in the beginning of the study, to hear from the community, and very pleased to present this draft report to the city for your review. We are having a public comment period for your study, as well as the 8 other participating entities, including Hennepin County, the City of St. Paul, and the State of Minnesota agencies and others. I'm going to race through a lot of material, and please stop me because it's we, of course, think this is a very important issue. But I want to be very respectful of your time and not get into more detail than is appropriate. But please, if there's questions that come to your attention, please stop me, or we can answer any questions at the end, and I'll have Blanca and Annette dive in and see where I messed up here. So in 1989, the city of Richmond had a minority business program. And one of the contractors who didn't get a contract because they didn't comply with the program, J.A. Croson Company, which we happened to interview in my 100 disparity studies that I've done around the country, J.A. Croson Company sued the city of Richmond and said, we think your MBE program is invalid. The city of Richmond said, look, 0.5% of our contract dollars are going to African-American owned firms, construction firms. We're a city that's a majority African-American population city. There is a disparity. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not enough information. That's not enough evidence of discrimination. You need to go back to the drawing boards and show us if there is a disparity between the utilization of minority-owned firms and the availability of those businesses, and gave some parameters about that, and then instructed the city of Richmond that their program must also be narrowly tailored. So there had to be evidence of discrimination, and it had to be a narrowly tailored program. They, in essence, applied the strict scrutiny standard of legal review, which is the most difficult standard for a city to meet. Anything else that you do is either illegal on its face or easier to have in place than a minority business program. So that was spring of 1989. By fall of 1989, many of the cities around the country were doing disparity studies. City County of Denver was one of those, and I got involved and have successfully completed more than 100 studies and defended programs in court over that time. So it's been an interesting journey. I've certainly learned a lot. And we worked with the city in the 1990s, the city of Minneapolis and others. It's nice to be coming back to see what's improved, but also be somewhat concerned about what still remains to be done. That's why you do a disparity study, because the U.S. Supreme Court said you have to do this to take any kind of action related to race-conscious programs. There are different legal standards for women business programs, but they are similar, not as onerous, but as similar to minority business programs. And for the first time, or one of the first times anywhere in the country, the city of Minneapolis and the other participating entities, which includes City of St. Paul, Hennepin County, the state, and others, asked us to incorporate research on businesses owned by persons with disabilities and by veterans. So that's an unusual and a more comprehensive study than is normally conducted. And now we have some good information on what are marketplace conditions for persons with disabilities and veterans, and can report that as well. The state of Minnesota has programs that are targeted towards businesses owned by persons with disabilities and veterans. Those types of programs are much more easily defended in court than minority business programs. We, with the help of your wonderful staff, and we could not have done this without them, and among the 9 entities, the people like Cynthia and Sean were kind of leaders because of their experience with disparity studies and with these types of programs. So with a lot of help of city staff, we were able to examine almost 7,000 procurements during our study period, totaling about $1.3 billion. We looked at large contracts, small contracts, subcontracts, and our goal was to see what percentage of those contract dollars were going to minority women-owned firms, whether or not they were certified, whether or not they were participating in one of your programs. The statistics that we'll show you include both certified and non-certified firms. We confirmed that most of your locally funded procurement was going to firms that had locations within the Twin Cities metro area. And then we had to develop benchmarks to measure the strength of that participation against what might have happened if there were a level playing field out in the marketplace. So if minority and women-owned firms in the local marketplace had the same opportunities as majority-owned firms, what percentage of city dollars would have gone to those types of companies? So we did an availability survey. We successfully contacted more than 20,000 firms throughout Minnesota. Most of those were in the Twin Cities area. And we asked them about their qualifications and interest in doing work for the city and others. Of those 20,000, 5,000 firms expressed qualifications and interest in public sector work, had bid on public sector work in the past, were really a part of this availability pool, really answering all the defects that the Supreme Court had with the city of Richmond's approach to this years ago. So this is not population-based, it's business-based, and we were looking at firms ready and willing and able to do city work. Of those firms, statewide,
If I can jump in here real quick, Councilmember Gordon has a question.
I'm just curious about where is the geography of those firms? How far does it go from the city? Those aren't all in Minneapolis. 5,000 firms within the
5,000 firms within the state.
Okay.
And most of those are Twin Cities firms. And we asked firms where they conducted work. So if you're in Mankato or St. Cloud, it may be that you conduct work here. It also may be that a Twin Cities firm will go out to Mankato or St. Cloud and do work as well. So one of our questions was not only what type of work do you do and what size of contracts do you bid on, but where geographically do you work?
Thank you.
So statewide, 28% of businesses are minority or women-owned. So this is not an unusual thing to come across a minority or female-owned business in Minnesota. Now, not all of those firms are equally available for all of the types of city procurements that you have. That you may have very big contracts as well as small contracts, and you could be building buildings, or you could be a specialty trade. And we looked at professional services, goods, and other services as well. So we performed a contract by contract availability analysis for each one of the 6,750 procurements that we examined for the city. Just as one example, we identified 92 businesses available for an excavation subcontract that was $400,000. We looked at firms that met the criteria that did that type of work, were around in that year in 2013, expressed qualifications and interest in doing subcontract work for the public sector and could work in the Twin Cities. Of those 92 firms, 21 were minority or women-owned, so the availability for that subcontract was 23%. And then we did that 6,749 more times. So we had a big spreadsheet with availability analyses for each one of those contracts. And instead of kind of averaging those results overall, we dollar weighted them so that the big contracts counted more. There were some contracts for which there was very limited availability of any firm, but no availability of minority women-owned firms. And there were some contracts that had a lot of availability. Those were weighted based on the size of those contracts to come up with an overall figure of what is a realistic benchmark for purposes of the disparity study. And the answer is 17.6% of city dollars, if there were a level playing field, would have gone to minority and women-owned firms. This excludes U.S. DOT-funded contracts that you might get that money through MnDOT, and you might apply the DBE program to. And it also excludes types of procurement such as computers and off-the-shelf software that you would buy from a national market. So that's what you would buy locally. And really through the efforts of city staff and the city's small and underutilized business program, you achieved 11% participation. That was less than availability, so there is a disparity. We think that 11.2% participation, a lot of that is achieved through the efforts of staff and the programs that you have in place, that the disparity would have been larger but for your program. Now, again, we need to, based on the court decisions, we need to start breaking that down by minority group, for white women-owned firms, and by industry. And here's a very simple breakdown by group. One of the first things that jumps out, so we have utilization in the left-hand column, availability benchmarks, which is the percentage of dollars that would go to each group if there were a level playing field, and then I'll explain the disparity index in a moment. So one of the things that's different about the city of Minneapolis and your programs and what you've been able to achieve is 5% of the dollars go to minority-owned firms, 6% of the dollars go to white women-owned firms. If you look at other entity participation, it's much more white women-owned firms that are able to take or have been taking advantage of these programs where the dollars are going, and the participation of minority-owned firms is very low. Here is more of a balance between what you've been able to achieve in minority business participation and participation of white women-owned firms. And so that's an advantage or an achievement of what the city of Minneapolis has been able to do that some of the other entities that we worked with were not able to do. There's still a disparity for minority-owned firms, but it's not as severe as what we found for the other entities. And we thought that was worth noting and reporting.
If I can jump in, excuse me, Councilmember Gordon.
So I just want to be clear that, so of all the firms that we looked at, all the 5,000 firms we looked at, 2.09% of them were Native American owned?
No.
Help me understand that column then.
Yeah. So that is when we looked at the types of work that firms could perform and the sizes of work firms could perform. The expected utilization of Native American-owned firms would be 2%. As I recall, somewhat less than 2% of the total firms are Native American-owned. But those firms, for your type of work, are more likely to perform that and work on bigger projects. And that may just be a couple firms, but that's, again, important. So the benchmark, if there were a level playing field and contracts went to firms just based on their qualifications, capabilities, what side of projects they bid on, you might expect about 2% of those dollars to go to Native American-owned firms. And that has to do with the mix of contracts that you all have. That number is a little bit less for the other participating entities. Maybe MnDOT was similar. I don't know if
I just want to understand this
Okay.
chart really well. So the disparity index is a pretty important number, right?
yes.
And what would show there's no disparity is if it was 100?
It would 100 means no disparity. So 20 for African American owned firms shows a substantial disparity. That's where achievement has not been, or a lot more needs to be done.
If it's under 100 and if it's well under 100, then we could justify it at the Supreme Court and others that we can take extraordinary measures to rectify injustice, whatever.
And I would not do it based off this chart. I would do it based off some of the detail where we go industry by industry, and we're evaluating the success of a program that you've had in place. That 3.56% participation in Native American-owned firms is because you've had a program. That might be zero if you didn't have a program.
And I'm just concerned that it'll be difficult for us to justify continuing all of our programs. And also the 93 index concerns me when in fact, some of the reasons why might have to do with how few firms actually provide the goods and services that we want that are owned by that particular demographics. And so, of course, we want to grow the availability and that. But should we be also so we might be a little bit concerned about the 93 for Asian American owned companies. That could threaten our justification for some programs, as well as the 170 for Native American owned. That threatens the justification for some programs. But we can clearly make the case for African American owned and Hispanic owned companies that we need to keep investing in programs. Is that a good conclusion?
I want to go to I need my slides as a crutch, council member.
All right.
I want to move to 2 more slides.
Okay. I'm close, though, right?
I testify about this in court, so I'm trying to be very precise here. This chart is a little difficult to see, but I wanted to pull out some of the results. A disparity, the courts have ruled that a disparity is substantial if you're more than 20% of where you should be. So if the disparity index is below 80, the courts have ruled that that is a substantial disparity. And this committee has probably seen that before in employment and discussions of employment, because that comes out of employment law and a discussion, EEO considerations. So that's just what the courts have been saying, is that amount of disparity, you can make an inference of discrimination, not necessarily by the city, but within the marketplace. Here we see disparities for both construction and professional services, except, and the except is for Native American-owned firms, and but for the program, we have evidence that there would have been a substantial disparity. And for other entities participating in this study, there was a substantial disparity for Native American-owned firms. You'll want to take a close look at all of the evidence for Asian American-owned.
Excuse me, Mr. Keene,
firms.
I have a question here from Councilmember Gordon.
So when we say but for the program, you think that gives us a strong foundation for continuing the program, and that your study says but for the program, we would have had a bigger disparity that will hold up in court?
It has.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon.
For goods procurements, even though you try to get minority and women-owned firms involved, that was substantial disparities for each group. For other services firms, you had much greater success in eliminating the disparities through the program. So if you look overall for minority and women-owned firms, you do not have a disparity for your other services procurements. But for the program, you would have had, we think, you would have had a disparity. And so you'll need to look carefully at the individual results and look carefully at the detailed discussion of these, all of the evidence in the disparity study. But we think, but for certified firms, there would have been a disparity for Hispanic American-owned other services firms. And we're looking at one lens to look at these results is as a program evaluation. So we looked back, and you had a disparity study done about 8 years ago, and you had extremely low participation of Asian American-owned other services firms and white women-owned firms and other services in the results of that past disparity study. So you're doing substantially better now. So the question would be, how long do you need to keep the program? And courts have given you some leeway to not say, you don't have to, as soon as your program is being effective, you don't have to throw it out. $2,449 firms or trade associations or other individuals gave input to us during the study above and beyond all this, the availability survey that we did. We did public meetings. We sat down and met with people individually. We talked with people over the phone. We did focus groups. So almost 2,500 people, and by the end of this process, probably more than 2,500 people will have taken the time to give us input. We think that's tremendous. And again, we appreciate all the efforts of folks that made their time available to give us information. Not everybody likes these programs, and we heard from those folks too. We had one organization commission an expert that has testified against these programs in court to write a report about our study methodology. And so we were able to get that early in the process and take a look at that and say, okay, well, that's good input. And you happen to be wrong here, but maybe that's a good idea. So we may get more of that type of input. Not everybody is supportive of these types of programs just on principle. We have others that say, well, we want set-asides and all the work go to minority women-owned firms, and that's probably not legally defensible. So what we really appreciated, and Annette Keene led this effort with our local subconsultants, is the business owners that might have spent an hour and a half talking with us about the whole history of experience of doing business in Minnesota or in the Twin Cities. And as Annette was describing in an earlier meeting today, sometimes there were tears involved, mostly theirs, but not always. And this is a heartfelt, this is your baby if it's your business. As you know, if you have small business people come and talk with you, and we're small business people, you put your heart and soul into this. And when you hear about unfair treatment based on your race or your ethnicity or gender, that is an emotional experience. We heard that. And so we thought that that was important to bring to you. We know that you're going to have some listening sessions, and we're going to have some public meetings also this week where we'll have even more opportunity for people to come to us. But the numbers that I just presented to you are a synthesis of a lot of individual business owners' experiences. And there are fewer minority and women-owned businesses in the Twin Cities today than there should be or would be, absent the effects of discrimination. There would be stronger minority and women-owned businesses today if people started out with the same access to capital and capitalization of their companies and the same opportunities along the way. You would be able to buy from a vendor pool and consultant and contractor pool that was stronger, but for marketplace discrimination. There are financial institutions in your community that have been found to be discriminatory, and we have individual business owners that explain some of those personal experiences with that. That continues to be an issue. So again, I worked with you this great city 20 years ago, and we heard many of the same things, and this struggle is not over. And these programs and the action on the behalf of public entities appears to still be needed. And that really comes through when you hear people talk about their personal experiences today. Maybe they have been in business long enough that we might have talked with them back in the 1990s. And everybody will say it's better, but they still have some of the same barriers that we were finding 20 years ago. We have recommendations for your consideration, and this is a city program. The city's had a program for quite a long time and continues to improve the program. So here's some additional things to think about. In addition to working with all of the other entities to try to remedy some of the marketplace barriers, the discrimination, evidence of discrimination we were seeing in the marketplace as a whole, and perhaps going to get state authorization to change some things in state law to give you more power to open opportunities for small businesses, which will help minority women-owned businesses, because we know that minority women-owned businesses are disproportionately small. And these are in no particular order, but I just wanted to alert you to some tools that you have now that you should make sure you're implementing as broadly as you legally can. And one of those tools is, because you have HUD dollars, there is a HUD outreach requirements in federal regulations. You have this tool now, and one of the things I've been pointing out to municipalities is when you have HUD funds, the requirements to do maximum outreach to the minority business community, which includes women-owned firms. There was some information in our study that even though the letter of the law is, your program is that professional services contracts be reviewed by the Department of Civil Rights for potential contract goals, the Department of Civil Rights can only set goals on contracts that they know about. And some of the contracts, professional services contracts, were being awarded without DCR review, so that could be tightened up. That is a great opportunity to get participation. And again, if that were happening here where some contracts slipped through the cracks by end user agencies, that's consistent with our experience with other cities, that's what end user departments do sometimes. You have 12% MBE and 13% WBE participation goals. Our availability is certainly in the ballpark. We are providing you some additional information that will help you set contract goals, and you may want to revisit your overall annual goals. And it's not a requirement that you have overall annual goals. This is a city decision. You may need more tools. So one of the things that the state of Minnesota has, MAC, the Metropolitan Airports Commission, is operating, and some of the other entities have, is a price and evaluation preference. This is rare around the country. The way this works is if you bid on a state contract for goods or other services, and you're a certified targeted business, and you bid, your bid is $1 million, and or your bid is $100,000, and somebody else's bid is $99,000. You, as the targeted business, get that bid because you get a 6% price preference, and that will swing the award from the non-TGB firm to the certified firm if their bid is within 6%. Of the low bidder. There's a similar evaluation preference. That is a tool that's rare around the country, but we're seeing it in Minnesota. You appear to not have authority for it, or the staff cannot implement that program today, that they would need to get authority for that type of program. You have a target market program that's relatively new. We are suggesting that you require certification as SBEs. The target market program is a sheltered market where some of your procurements can go to small businesses. We're suggesting that you tighten up the certification of that program. And a good rule of thumb is if you're requiring minority women-owned firms to go through rigorous certification to participate in a program, make white male-owned firms go through that same certification process. So everybody's on the equal footing. The target market program has some size limits that may need refining. We're suggesting some ways to do that, and some other kind of administrative best practices on that program are listed here. One of the strengths of a good minority and women business program is if it develops firms to be big enough to compete without the program. And we gave the city some examples of effective programs, such as a City of Portland, Oregon prime contractor development program, where it has been a capacity building focused, where not only are firms getting city contracts, but those firms, and many of them are minority and women owned, are going through technical assistance, getting bonding, getting funding to be able to take on bigger and bigger construction projects. The City of Portland doesn't put any of its small construction contracts, doesn't award any of those contracts without going through this program. Those 100% of their small contracts will go through their prime contractor development program. So they have some real energy behind this. Hennepin County has some good examples of some very targeted programs as well. So not only do you have some case studies of types of programs like target market program to share with other Twin Cities entities, but you can learn from some of the programs that others are doing also. So this is a draft report. I'm available to answer questions about it. We have a rigorous public meeting program that begins shortly over at the Urban League, Minneapolis Urban League, starting at 5 o'clock. We hope to see you there. Everybody is invited. We'll do one tomorrow at the Wellstone Center. There are listening sessions here next week. And then for anyone who in the Twin Cities or elsewhere that cannot attend physically a public meeting, we're having a webinar on Wednesday from 11 to 12:30, and then heading up to Duluth and down to Rochester towards the end of the week. If you ask me hard questions, Annette and Blanca are going to answer them, or Sean. But what questions can they answer? And thank you for devoting so much time to this today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Keene. Council Member Schrader.
Thank you, Chair Cunningham, and thank you, and as well as the Department of Civil Rights. When you go through the report, you can tell how much work and resources have been put into that. When I read through it, I had a couple other questions, and I also want to kind of extend an additional thanks to the Department of Civil Rights for really taking the time to help me find those answers. And I had just a couple of those I'd love to run through just to kind of add to the public record. You mentioned in your report that you reached out to over 20,000 firms. When you look in the appendix, it talks about over 12,000 saying that they weren't interested. And that number really stuck out because the reason I would see to go through this report is to find out why people aren't interested. Is it something we're doing wrong? And especially that's over 60% that weren't interested. Could you talk a little bit about, what the outreach was after they said they weren't interested, and how we see that in the report?
Well, certainly the outreach continues today and through this week. So some firms might be available for this type of work and have been discouraged. And as much as possible, we tried to reach out to those firms through the study. But I think this is the best opportunity for those firms to come to attend a public meeting or provide us comments through email or on our study website. But let me answer your question about, is that a large number? And we think not necessarily. And the reason for that is we were over-inclusive because we wanted to draw as wide a net as possible. We were over-inclusive in the firms that we reached out to about their availability for public sector work. So we have electrical firms who may only do residential electrical contracting, not ever bid on a public sector project, but we reached out to them statewide. And a lot of them said, no, the last thing I'd want to do is work for a public entity and doing electrical work for whatever reason. And we thought it was important for the same reasons I was describing in the Croson decision. The more you can fine-tune your availability figure, the more you've taken arguments away from people who don't like these programs and say that our methodology is flawed, or the information that we were basing our availability on was too broad or too generic. And I've testified about this in multiple court cases, won every one of them, and we tend to be on the more rigorous side to be able to answer those types of questions than, say, your previous disparity study consultant who did not do that type of analysis. They would have just looked at the list and said everybody was available. So we called them. A number of people said they weren't available, weren't interested, and some of them just simply didn't want to take the time to give us information, even though it was prefaced with, hey, wouldn't you like, we're doing outreach to see who's out there that maybe the participating entities haven't learned about and want to be on a list to get future notices of bids. So one of the key things is the 12,000 or whatever that number was. Are those firms different in terms of minority and women business composition than those 5,000 firms that were in our final availability pool? Is there anything about our research process that was more likely to miss a minority women-owned firm? And so we did some research on what do we know about those firms that said, no, not interested. And we found the minority and women business composition was about the same as the 5,000 that did say, yes, I'm qualified and interested. And that gave us some comfort that our methodology did not kind of skew one way or the other and leave out often different interests will say, well, you left me out, or you left my constituency out. And there's no evidence that we did, even though there are some pockets of the minority business population that are very difficult to reach in any kind of research method. You have some of those populations here in Minnesota. We did capture some firms, and a lot of those firms would have said, no, not interested, mainly because they don't provide the type of work that would be involved in a public sector project. They would be more community focused, more retail, more kind of serving the homes and neighborhoods where they are located rather than selling to a public entity.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Gordon. Oh, I'm sorry. Follow up from Trader.
Just to warn you, we had about 3 questions. So, but on that, I did want to lift up from your answer that there was going back and checking, because my main concern was that we were not getting the answer to the question of why individual businesses were not interested in working with the city. So I'm glad to see that was done there. But it also, I was wondering why that number wasn't brought up a little bit earlier. It is a lengthy discussion, and it did get me to read more of the report because that number kind of stuck out. But that said, just why wasn't that kind of put a little bit on the front end?
Well, we're used to seeing it for one thing, so perhaps we get immune to that. And the reasons that firms bring up for not being interested in public sector work, a lot of those may be not insurmountable, but less surmountable than of the firms that are actively participating and trying to get public sector work and facing those barriers. Can you remove those barriers, or can you further develop the capabilities of those firms where they're more successful at getting public sector work? So when people say flat out no, kind of reject the idea of getting public sector work, we take that at face value, and you can't get somebody to talk to you that's really not interested. There wasn't anything in it for them. We were able to talk to some of their trade associations, though. And so some of the groups that were representing those types of companies, we learned more from those individuals about why that may be so. And, paperwork, incumbent businesses, closed doors, not feeling welcome, not understanding the process, excessive bonding in the case of construction, or insurance requirements for even the simplest jobs. The list goes on. And the businesses that we talked with that do try to do public sector work, they were saying the same thing. So some of the barriers were very consistent between some of what the trade associations were telling us, that their members may not be, or the folks they represent may not be integrated into the public contracting and bidding process, were very consistent with some of the other things we're hearing from small businesses that were trying to crack this market.
Great. Also, in the report, it talks a lot about a custom census. Could you briefly talk about, what it is and why you used it in the study?
Yes. So we started with two sources of information to reach out to firms that totaled 50,000 companies in total. We aggregated what we called an interested bidders list from each one of the participating entities. So we took the city of Minneapolis list, the city of St. Paul list, state of Minnesota has a big list, and we put all those together, deduplicated them, and that was one set of information. And then we were worried for the same reasons that you just brought up that, well, these are firms that are kind of in the process already. What about all the other firms that might be able to provide work? So we got from Dun & Bradstreet all firms in Minnesota that do the types of work involved in public sector contracting that amounts to a substantial portion of public sector contracting. And we added those firms, and then we called each one of those firms. And we called them once, twice, 3 times. There was a website where they could submit information as well. They could get a fax survey and send it back. So courts that have looked at this approach, even here in Minnesota, this is a highly litigious issue if I haven't expressed that clearly yet. Some of the courts that have favorably reviewed availability methodology that's similar to ours called it a custom census. And we say, hey, we can use those 2 words too, because we start with a custom census and make it even more custom and census-y, because we reach out to everybody. Everybody got an opportunity to participate in this, and we fine-tuned it down to those firms that are active participants in this market and gave us all the information about what types of work they do, where they do it, what size of contracts they bid on, kind of spent the time. So when I'm testifying in court and somebody says, your availability is just junk, you just read the number out of a book. And I said, no, we talked to these firms, we called them, they spent the time with us to indicate their specific qualifications and ability to do work for the participating entities in Minnesota.
Great. My final question, just if you could explain, this is a lot of great data, and I wanted to see, is this data that the city will own, and if so, like what's the release date on that, when we could start using it going forward?
We've already started providing some kind of custom aggregations of the data just for the city, and as soon as the study is complete, it is the city's data. And so we're weeks away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Trader. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I have about 4 questions and a staff direction at the end. And I'm just curious about some of the things that you said. I was intrigued with Portland's program. They gave some capacity building to the smaller businesses. Is this a program then that's free once they get the contract that the city provides to them? Or do they have to pay for it?
I don't think they need to pay for it. It's a requirement that you participate in the technical assistance part to participate in the program and get the contracts. And you're bidding against other firms in the program.
Okay. So maybe they take it beforehand somewhere else?
They
take
tier
it from the city.
They start small. And so it may be contracts, I forget the tiers, but say it's under $100,000. So you have to have been in business for 3 years. You have to meet certain other requirements. And as part of participating in this program, you have to be investing your business time and resources in the, as far as I know, free capacity building technical assistance that the city provides.
The city provides it. Okay, excellent. I'm also curious about a couple things you said. One was you were kind of implying that certain departments or divisions of the city aren't getting their service contracts for $100,000 over to the civil rights. Did you have any more specifics?
I'll let you ask the Department of Civil Rights about that.
Okay, and I don't know whether I'll go to my other questions and we'll see if they want to respond to that. You also suggested that there are some financial institutions, maybe in the state or the city of Minneapolis, that are using discriminatory practices. Do you want to tell us which financial institutions are?
We name those that the Department of Justice has found that they are discriminatory in the report.
Is Wells Fargo one of those? U.S. Bank?
I think we might have mentioned Wells Fargo in a different context,
Okay.
but I simply don't, I'm not being coy with you, I simply don't remember the specific institution that was a recent, one of the recent finding of discrimination.
And then my fourth question, you talked about veterans and persons with disabilities, and I saw a lot of information about them in the report, but I never got to some of the high-level understandings in terms of availability and utilization for the city of Minneapolis. Do we have numbers for that, and can you, or any recommendations about that?
You do not have numbers, and the reason for that is it would be like any other program that you would enact. You don't need, the legal basis is rational basis test. Any other municipal action that's not race or gender based would probably be rational basis test challenge. Anybody can say, I don't like your city ordinance, I'm going to sue you, and you have to defend it. And it's fairly easy to defend compared to a minority business program. A veteran business program and a program for persons with disabilities is at that rational basis test legal standard, which is very easy to meet. And we found that persons with disabilities who own businesses earned less than other people who own businesses. That may be enough to survive a legal challenge. The evidence was not as clear-cut for veteran-owned businesses. And if you think about it, when we did the research on who those veteran businesses are, first of all, they are mostly white men, and they're mostly older white men in Minnesota. People who own businesses tend to be older. Although there are Iraq veterans and Afghan war veterans that are coming back and starting businesses, that was not at this point the majority of those types of businesses. So they were more established, stronger. There weren't that many differences in terms of the disparities weren't considerable between veteran-owned businesses and non-veteran-owned businesses, primarily by the composition of who owned those businesses, which is largely white men in Minnesota. So clear evidence of disparities for persons with disabilities, less clear for veterans. But it may be that you don't even need that information if you're the state of Minnesota, for example, and you have a veteran-owned business program. Saying this is a good thing may be enough. We don't know. Very, very different than programs for minority business owners and female business owners in terms of what legal thresholds you need to meet.
Interesting. All right, thank you. And maybe I'll wait till the other questions come before I make the staff direction in case other committee members. Is that all right, Mr. Chair?
That sounds great. Thank you. I have a few questions, and I'll pass it on over to Councilmember Jenkins. So I just wanted to go back to the African-American community disparity. It's pretty bad. That's pretty severe. What was it, 20? It was at a 20 overall. And so I just wanted to hear from you some of the factors that went into causing such a large disparity. I mean, aside from discrimination, but what are some of the factors that went into there? And there's some missed opportunities there.
The history of discrimination is different against African-Americans in general and African-American-owned businesses. We certainly saw that in the numbers, and we saw that in the qualitative information as well. I don't know, that's in the marketplace. And a lot of the information in the study is really documenting that. I was listening to the previous presentation about how everything is interrelated. And so if you have discrimination in housing, and Council Member Gordon's comments about some of the presentations you've had in the past, just as an example, if you have a historic discrimination in housing, you then have lower homeownership rates for African Americans in this community, still dramatically. You have lower home values for people who do own homes. You have historic discrimination in home mortgages for the African American community in Minnesota, and you may still have. And where do you find the money to start a business? Well, it's often pulling equity out of a home. So if you don't own a home because of discrimination, or you have low home value because of discrimination, or you're discriminated against when you get a home equity loan, and there is evidence that that has happened, then you're already behind. And you even haven't started a business yet. So, and that that web of interrelated effects of past discrimination, intergenerational and current, affects the African American community across the country as much as or more than any other group. And Minnesota is no different.
Thank you. I appreciate the history piece because African Americans were the only group that legally was banned from being able to own businesses and be able to buy homes in certain areas. But like even in the antebellum period, the access to capital, the lack of access to capital was still a problem. And so it is now even today. And so I appreciate that history. I was also wanting to get some clarity. Is there any disaggregated data specifically on women of color?
We did look at women of color. And and I don't recall the specific statistics, but we were very interested in, because we were looking at minority-owned businesses and we were including women of color in our data for minority-owned businesses. And we had veterans and we had persons with disabilities and other groups. We were looking at the intersection between all of those different groups. And we specifically broke out women of color of each minority group. And we have that information in the report. It's in chapter 5 of the report. I have a great memory for this stuff, but I simply can't recall some of the results that we had. You're not required by the courts in the utilization and availability analysis to do a disparity analysis for African American male-owned companies, African American female-owned companies. And in Minnesota, if you start to do that, you get groups that are so small that it's very hard to say very much about it. The courts simply don't require it. The reason we grouped, we had white women-owned firms as a group, is the logic was, if there's gender-based discrimination, that's where you're going to see it show up, because it's white male-owned firms and white female-owned firms, and are there differences in outcomes for white female-owned firms? And the answer is yes. And then our logic, which I've testified about and the courts have upheld, the logic is gender discrimination sees no color. I mean, it may, but the courts have held if there's gender discrimination and you're an African American female, you face double discrimination. You face discrimination as a female as well as an person of color. And if you find disparities for white women-owned firms, that's also very relevant for minority female-owned firms. And as I recall, some of the disparity study results from the last round of disparity studies, which we did not do, the ones that were 6, 7, 8 years ago, there might have been some confusion or misinterpretation of some of that information, and you might have had some illogical outcomes where a white woman would get benefit of a program and a black woman would not, which makes absolutely no sense to us. So we would urge you to properly review the results. If there's just gender discrimination, it affects all women.
Great, thank you. And my last question is, so I know that veterans with disabilities work, folks with disabilities were also disaggregated data collected. And I know that in the targeted group program at the state level that veterans and folks with disabilities are considered within that, and also LGBT BEs. And so I was curious as to whether or not, because I know that the city is not on parity with the state because we don't identify veterans, folks with disabilities, and LGBT business enterprises. And so is there any particular reason why that demographic was left out of this? Because you're talking about intersectionally, and just wondering why.
So we actually considered that when that was brought to our attention. And it was the 9 entities that we were our client, with the Department of Administration kind of leading the charge. We took a look at that issue and they decided, okay, for this disparity study, we're not going to examine it. It kind of came in late in the process. But we came back and they asked us to say, well, does anybody do this? Does anybody have a program for gay and lesbian-owned businesses? And there are cities that do. So I think this is something that you can take a look at. The other thing that we, especially for the city of Minneapolis, because you may be in a good position, or this may be a tool that you will need in the future. There's a way to structure programs where it's socially and economically disadvantaged individuals that are eligible for the program. And you can be socially disadvantaged for many reasons. Certainly economically disadvantaged, you don't want large businesses to, I mean, this should be a small business focused and a focus for businesses owned by people that don't have substantial wealth. Because you have very wealthy people have a small business and they don't need that assistance, and they have not been discriminated against based on their economic status. So we're working with the city of New Orleans right now on a socially and economically disadvantaged business program that there may be many ways of showing social disadvantage. Being part of the LGBT community might be one of those disadvantages. And you are now at the point where you might want to consider converting your DBE-based program, because you need to be DBE certified to be a participant in your program. It's very close. It would not take many changes. Again, I'm speaking off script a little bit, so I may have the department people school me once I get outside the door. But something that they might consider and bring to City Council is, can you open up the program for people with more social disadvantage than what you recognize right now, and perhaps not specify it and say, here are our grounds for examining social disadvantage and economic disadvantage, which you already have. And the firms that you've already certified would probably meet those criteria. And that is a much more easy program to defend, because you're not assuming anything. You're not assuming based on color, based on gender. You're making it so it's open to anyone with a social disadvantage. So the city of New Orleans, for example, will deny certification to an African-American owned firm that comes in and says, I'm not socially disadvantaged. I'm part of the power structure of New Orleans and I'm just fine. And they say, well, thank you very much. Good for you. You are not eligible for our program.
Got it.
And same thing with the white male that comes in and says, because of my past history, I am socially disadvantaged. They can get certified. And in their program right now, they have 600 firms or so that are certified under that program. Somewhat under 100 of them are white male-owned firms.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure that we name that in this space as well, because there is a misconception that LGBT often means white cisgender man, and then that also conjures thoughts of affluence and this particular assumption about what the LGBTQ community looks like and what it means. And so thank you so much for bringing that in. Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Cunningham and Mr. Keene. You mentioned the target market program and how potentially tightening up certification might be one effort that we can take. Do you have recommendations around what could be some tightening measures in that certification process? And then just as a follow-up, you talked about making white male-owned firms go through that certification process as well. And I was just hoping you could expound on that a little bit more too.
Sure. So for the target market program, and this is new for the city, it's related. There's a lot of things that are different about that program than the small and underutilized business program. Mm-hmm. So integrating those two programs would be one of our recommendations. Not just letting people self-certify under the target market program would be another. There are revenue limits to that program right now that are less rigorous, less refined than your small and underutilized business program. As an example, I think it's any construction firm with revenues of $10 million or less can be in the program. with your SUBP program, that would actually have different size standards based on what type of construction business you are. So if you're a general contractor, $10 million is a small business, and a $20 million business might be a small business. If you're a painter and you're doing $10 million a year in revenue, you're real large.
Yeah.
And it's a blanket $10 million. So there are tools in place already at the city where you look at what type of construction business are you, what type of professional services business are you, and you can tailor those thresholds or ceilings to participation in the program much finer with really no additional effort than what you have right now. And one of our concerns is you want to make this really work for minority and women-owned firms as well as white male-owned firms. I'm not sure you've structured the program to really work it as well for MBE-WBEs as you might. And we saw disparities, so there's certainly a need. You're not done yet. And you're maybe missing an opportunity to get even more minority and women business participation in there. The program was so new that we didn't have a lot of data to know what it's accomplishing. So these are more questions rather than that we wanted to bring up to staff and to the city council, rather than, hey, you need to do this, this, and this, because we've looked at all the evidence and it's failing in some way. We don't know whether it is, but our experience in similar types of programs, you may be missing an opportunity here.
Thank you, sir.
Are there any other questions? Councilmember Gordon, did we want to come back to you now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a staff direction, which is essentially to follow up on these recommendations and focusing in on one recommendation in particular. I'll read the staff direction and people can respond to it, but I'd like to move and direct the City Coordinator's Office, the Procurement Division of Finance and Property Services, the Civil Rights Department, and the City Attorney's Office to research and review the results of the study and return with recommendations for further action to this committee no later than August 30th, 2018, including, but not limited to, a recommendation on enacting a price and evaluation preference program for prime contractors and vendors, similar to the state targeted group program. Maybe I could just speak to that for a minute.
Yes, please.
Or less. I was very intrigued by the idea of having this price and evaluation preference program for prime contractors, and I'm assuming prime contractors just means the general contractor who gets the work, as opposed to subcontractors. And I think that it would really help if policymakers could put something out so there's an automatic scoring system that would just happen, and it would make it much easier for these awards to happen. And I want to explore that and look at that, and as well as the other recommendations.
All right, thank you, Councilmember. Are there any other last questions or thoughts? Seeing none, I move to receive and file this item.
So I also moved
Oh,
my
I'm
staff
sorry.
direction.
What do we have to do?
So I did move that staff direction.
Oh, we have to vote on the motion? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
excuse me.
Okay.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. The ayes have it. And now, seeing no further questions, I move to receive and file the item. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. That item is received and filed. Seeing no further business before this committee, we are adjourned.